24 minutes. That is how close an entire nation came to the greatest night in its football history before it all slipped through their fingers. The setting was Houston. On one side stood the most decorated team the sport has ever produced. On the other stood a side that had spent decades being told they were admirable, disciplined, and ultimately not quite good enough. And for an hour in that Texas heat, the underdog was not merely surviving. The underdog was winning. Then the lead vanished. The pressure came in waves, and with the scoreline level and his players gasping for air, the manager turned to his bench and made a series of decisions that an entire country has been arguing about ever since. He took off the man flying up and down the right. He took off the man patrolling the left. And a little later, he took off the quickest, most direct attacker he had left on the pitch. 3 changes. 3 of his most dangerous players gone, and by the time the final whistle sounded, those 3 substitutions had become the story of the match, the story of the entire tournament for Japan, and a question that simply refuses to go away. Why did he do it? Why, with the biggest result in the country's history sitting right there in front of him, did Hajime Moriyasu take off Ritsu Doan, then Keito Nakamura, and then Junya Ito? In this video, we are going to break it down decision by decision, minute by minute, and answer that question properly. Because the truth is more complicated and more painful than the highlight reel suggests. But to understand the substitutions, you first have to understand the night they happened on. So let us go back to the beginning. This was Brazil against Japan, the round of 32, the first true knockout round of an expanded 48-team World Cup. For Brazil, this was simply another step on a road they expected to walk all the way to the final. 5 times world champions, the most successful nation the game has ever known, now coached by Carlo Ancelotti, the most decorated club manager in history, taking charge of his first major tournament as an international boss. They had cruised through the group stage, brushing past Scotland and Haiti, and they arrived in Houston as heavy favorites against an opponent they were expected to control. For Japan, the stakes were different, and they were enormous. The Samurai Blue had become a permanent fixture at this level. They had beaten Germany, they had beaten Spain, they had drawn with the Netherlands earlier in this very tournament, but beating a giant in a one-off knockout match, on this stage, with everything on the line, was the mountain they had never quite climbed. A win here would have been one of the greatest results in the entire history of Japanese football. And Moriyasu had to chase that result without his most gifted creator. Takefusa Kubo, the Real Sociedad playmaker, the man Japan builds so much of their attacking imagination around, had injured his left knee in the opening match against the Netherlands and was ruled out of the Brazil game entirely. That absence matters to this whole story because it placed an even heavier burden on the players who did start. With Kubo watching from the sidelines, the creative load fell onto the shoulders of Doan, of Nakamura, of Junya Ito, of Daichi Kamada, the very players who would later be at the center of the controversy. Moriyasu set his team up in a 3-at-the-back system, a 3-4-2-1. Zion Suzuki in goal, a goalkeeper who had spent the season turning heads in Italy. In front of him, a back 3 of Hiroki Ito, Shogo Taniguchi, and Takehiro Tomiyasu. In midfield, a engine room anchored by Kaishu Sano. And then the wide men. On the right, Ritsu Doan. On the left, Keito Nakamura. In this shape, those two are wingbacks, and that detail is the key that unlocks everything that follows. Because a wingback in a 3-4-2-1 is asked to do the single most physically demanding job in modern football. When the team attacks, the wingback is a winger, sprinting the length of the touchline to overlap and cross and stretch the pitch. When the team defends, that same wingback has to retreat all the way back into a back 5, becoming a fullback, tracking runners, covering ground that nobody else can cover. Up and down, again and again, for 90 minutes, with no winger ahead of them to share the load and no fullback behind them to cover the gap. They are the gap. They are the cover. They are the width in attack and the safety net in defense, all at once, in the same shirt, against an ordinary opponent. That is exhausting. Against Brazil, it is close to impossible, because the man Doan and Nakamura had to deal with was not an ordinary winger. On one flank prowled Vinicius Jr., one of the fastest, trickiest, most relentless attackers on the planet, a forward who lives to isolate a tiring fullback and run at him in space. And behind Vinicius sat a bench stacked with more pace, more legs, more fresh attackers that Ancelotti could throw on at will, asking two wingbacks to attack the length of the pitch and then sprint back to smother that threat over and over was always going to come with a clock attached. The only question was when the clock would run out. Hold that thought. We will come back to it. The match kicked off, and almost immediately the script that everyone expected was torn up. Brazil were sluggish, heavy. They struggled to break down a Japanese block that was compact, disciplined, and refused to panic. And then, on 29 minutes, the unthinkable. A sloppy pass out of the Brazilian defense, some hesitant work from Casemiro, and the ball broke to Keito Sano on the edge of the box. He did not hesitate. He curled a beautiful strike past Alisson and into the net. Japan won, Brazil 0. The stadium erupted. Back in Japan, in the small hours of the morning, living rooms shook. This was really happening. The first half ended with Japan in front, having restricted the five-time champions to almost nothing of real danger. Brazil had enjoyed the ball but done little with it. Japan had the lead, the structure, and the belief. At halftime, the underdog was 30 minutes from history. But football is cruel, and Brazil are Brazil. Whatever Ancelotti said in that dressing room, it worked. The second half brought a different Brazil onto the pitch. Sharper, hungrier. They began to press higher, to dominate the ball with purpose rather than just patience, and slowly the game tilted. The warning signs flashed. Casemiro had a header cleared off the line. The pressure built and built. And then, on 56 minutes, it broke. Gabriel Magalhaes swung an across from the left, and this time Casemiro rose at the far post and powered his header past Zion Suzuki. Brazil level. 1-1. And you could feel, instantly, that the entire texture of the match had changed. Brazil smelled blood. Vinicius Jr. produced a moment of pure brilliance, a slaloming solo run that ended with the ball striking the inside of the post and Suzuki somehow scrambling it clear. The momentum had swung completely. Japan, who had been so composed, so controlled, suddenly looked like a team hanging on. They had stopped getting out of their own half. They were being pinned back deeper and deeper, defending for their lives. This is the moment. This is the situation Moriyasu was staring at when he reached for his bench. 1-1. A pulsating, hostile wave of Brazilian attacks crashing against his defense. His wingbacks, Doan and Nakamura, running themselves into the ground trying to hold back the tide. And a decision to make that could define his entire career. On 66 minutes, he made it. Off came Ritsu Doan. Off came Keito Nakamura. On came Yukinari Sugawara and Junosuke Suzuki. Two of Japan's brightest attacking threats, withdrawn in a single double change, replaced by players whose first instinct is to defend. So why? Why pull your two widest, most dangerous outlets at the exact moment the game is on a knife edge? Start with the physical reality, because it is the most honest answer. Remember what we said about wingbacks. Doan and Nakamura had just spent more than an hour doing the hardest running on the pitch, and crucially, with Brazil now dominating, almost all of that running had become defensive. Sprinting back, recovering, covering. When your team cannot keep the ball, your wingbacks do not get to rest on the ball in the opposition half. They are simply chasing, over and over, with no relief. By the hour mark, two of the most willing runners in the squad were very likely running on empty, and a tired wing back against Vinicius Jr. is a defensive catastrophe waiting to happen. Now, look at who replaced them. Yukinari Sugawara is a natural fullback, a defender by trade, a player whose game is built first and foremost on stopping wingers rather than tormenting fullbacks. Junosuke Suzuki is a defender as well. This was not a like-for-like swap. This was a deliberate shift in the character of the team. Moriyasu was taking 2 attacking wingbacks off the board and putting 2 defensive-minded players on, effectively reinforcing the flanks, hardening that backline, turning his 3-4-2-1 into something that looked far more like a back 5, built to absorb and to survive. In plain terms, this was a message. With the game level and Brazil surging, Moriyasu was choosing to protect what he had. He was prioritizing the clean sheet over the counterattack. He was looking at the clock, looking at extra time and the possibility of penalties, and deciding that the safest route to the result he wanted was to batten down the hatches and refuse to lose, rather than to keep trading blows with a wounded but ferocious Brazil. There is a logic to it, a cold, rational, percentage-driven logic. You cannot attack Brazil forever. You cannot keep tired legs out there against fresh Brazilian wingers and expect them to hold. So you freshen the defensive areas, you sit a little deeper, you make yourself hard to break down, and you back yourself to either nick something on a rare counter or drag the tie into extra time, where anything can happen and where a single moment of fortune can send you through. But there is a cost to that logic, and Japan were about to pay it. Because here is the problem with taking off your wingbacks and going defensive. Doan and Nakamura were not just defenders. They were the release valve. They were the outlet. When a team is under siege, the way you survive is not only by defending well, it is by being able to keep the ball when you win it, to push the play up the pitch, to give your exhausted defenders even 30 seconds of breathing room. Doan in particular is the kind of player who can carry the ball out of trouble, beat a man, win a foul, force the opposition to retreat and reset. Take that quality off the pitch and replace it with 2 players whose instinct is to clear and defend, and you remove your own ability to relieve pressure. You invite the siege to continue without end. And the siege did continue. 12 minutes after that first double change, with Brazil still swarming, Moriyasu went back to his bench for the third and most debated decision of the night. On 78 minutes, off came Junya Ito. Off came Daichi Kamada. On came Shuto Machino and Ao Tanaka. This one stung even more because of who Junya Ito is. Junya Ito is pace. Junya Ito is directness. He is the player who, on the rare occasions Japan did break free, could carry the ball 70 yards and frighten a defense all on his own. In a game where Japan were desperate for any kind of outlet, any way of getting up the pitch and away from their own goal, Junya Ito was arguably the most important attacking weapon they had left, and Moriyasu took him off. The reasoning, again, comes back to the same themes. Fatigue, first of all. Ito had been running himself into exhaustion, and like the wingbacks, much of that running had been backwards, defending, tracking, with little reward. A spent Junya Ito is far less dangerous than a fresh one, and Moriyasu may simply have judged that the version of Ito still on the pitch no longer had the legs to make the difference. But there was a second factor with the man who came off alongside him, and it is one that often gets forgotten. Daichi Kamada had been booked back in the first half, a yellow card for a cynical foul on Casemiro to break up a counter. In a frantic physical match with a level scoreline, a player on a yellow card is a liability. One mistimed challenge, one moment of frustration, and Kamada could have been sent off, leaving Japan to defend against Brazil with 10 men. Replacing a booked, tiring midfielder with the fresh legs and defensive energy of Ao Tanaka removes that risk completely and gives the midfield a new battery just when it needs one. Shuto Machino, meanwhile, offered a fresh body up front, a different kind of runner to lead the line and chase lost causes. So when you lay it all out, the picture of Moriyasu's thinking becomes clear. Every single one of these changes points in the same direction. Doan off, Nakamura off, Junya Ito off, Kamada off. attacking players and tiring players, swapped for defenders, fresh legs, and security. This was a manager who looked at a level game against the most dangerous attacking team on Earth, looked at his exhausted players, and made a conscious, deliberate choice to stop trying to win the game in 90 minutes, and instead try to survive it. To reach extra time, to reach penalties. To find a way through on the percentages rather than the gamble. And on paper, it is defensible, genuinely. Plenty of respected coaches would have done something very similar. You manage the game. You protect the result. You trust your structure. You get to the lottery of penalties against a Brazil side that had looked nervous and beatable all night, and you take your chances there. It is not cowardice. It is a recognized, legitimate way to win knockout football, and it has carried teams all the way to World Cup glory before. But football does not reward intentions. It rewards outcomes. And the outcome here was brutal, because once Japan made that collective choice to drop deeper and defend, they could not get back out. The release valve was gone. The pace was gone. The players capable of holding the ball up the pitch were sitting in the dressing room. And so Brazil did what a great team does to a team that has invited it forward. They poured everything onto the Japanese goal. The numbers from the closing stages tell a story that is almost difficult to look at. Across the match, Brazil finished with an expected goals figure of well over 1.5. Japan finished on around 0.2 of a single goal. 0.2 in the entire match. That is the statistical signature of a team that had completely surrendered the initiative, that had stopped creating anything at all, that was doing nothing but defending and hoping. Zion Suzuki, the goalkeeper, faced shot after shot and made save after save. 6 efforts on target arriving at his goal, a mountain of pressure that he held back almost single-handedly. Brazil's young wingers, Endrick and Ryan, grew into the match and began to torment a backline that had no way of pushing them away. Japan were not managing the game anymore. They were drowning in it and praying for the whistle. And then, deep into stoppage time, the dam broke. It was the 95th minute. Bruno Guimaraes, given far too much time in midfield because there was no longer a Japanese player with the legs to close him down, slid a perfectly weighted pass through the heart of the defense. And running onto, it was Gabriel Martinelli, a substitute himself, brought on by Ancelotti precisely to add the fresh, direct, incisive threat that Japan no longer had at the other end. Martinelli took one touch and curled the ball across Suzuki and into the net. Brazil 2, Japan 1. In the 95th minute. The dagger. There was no time to respond. There was no response left in them to give. Moments later, the whistle blew and the dream was over. The cameras found the Japanese players collapsed on the turf, some on their knees, some flat on their backs staring up at the Houston sky, others in tears. In the stands, the blue shirts stood frozen in silence. They had been minutes away. They had controlled long stretches of a match against the most successful team in World Cup history, and they had walked off it with nothing. A landmark victory had turned, in the space of one defensive hour, into one of the most painful defeats the country has ever suffered. And so we return to the question we started with. Why did Japan replace Doan, Nakamura, and Ito? And now you understand that the answer is not a single reason, but a chain of them, all linked, all pointing the same way. Tired legs in the most demanding roles on the pitch. A level scoreline against an opponent growing stronger by the minute. A backline that needed reinforcing. A booked midfielder who could not be risked. And above all, a manager making a calculated bet that the safest path to victory was to stop attacking, harden up, and take Brazil to extra time. Every change was logical on its own. Every change made sense in the moment. The tragedy is that, added together, they removed the very thing keeping Japan alive. They took away the team's ability to breathe, and a team that cannot breathe against Brazil eventually suffocates. So, was Moriyasu wrong? This is where the argument truly begins, and it is an argument worth having honestly, because there are two genuine sides to it. The case for the defense goes like this. You cannot judge a decision purely by its result. At 1-1, with your wide players visibly exhausted and Brazil throwing waves of fresh attackers at you, keeping tired legs on the pitch is its own enormous risk. A gassed wingback gets turned by Vinicius, and you concede anyway, except earlier and more easily. Reaching extra time and penalties against a jittery Brazil was a real, rational target, and getting there required survival, not adventure. Moriyasu has managed this team for years. He knows their limits better than any of us, and he made the percentage play. Sometimes you make the right decision and still lose. That is sport. The case for the prosecution is just as strong. When you take off every attacking outlet you have, you do not reduce the pressure on your defense. You multiply it. You hand the opponent the ball, the territory, and the initiative, and you ask a tired backline to hold out with no help and no escape for half an hour. You remove your own ability to counter, which is the one thing that might have made Brazil hesitate. Fortune favors the brave, the saying goes, and Japan stopped being brave at the exact moment bravery might have saved them. Keep Doan on. Keep Junya Ito and his pace on, and maybe Brazil cannot commit so many bodies forward. Maybe Bruno Guimaraes does not get that yard of space in the 95th minute, because someone is there to make him think twice. Both of those arguments are true at the same time. That is what makes this so agonizing for everyone who watched it. There was no obviously correct answer, only a choice between two kinds of risk, and the one Moriyasu chose happened to end in heartbreak. Change one bounce of the ball, one save, one offside flag, and we are telling a completely different story tonight. A story about a brave defensive masterclass and a coach who got his team to extra time against the odds. But that is the brutal beauty of knockout football. The margins are razor thin, and history is written by the outcome. The substitutions that would have been hailed as wise game management in a victory are instead remembered as the changes that invited the defeat. The same decisions, the same logic, judged entirely by which way the final bounce fell. And maybe that is the real lesson buried in this whole heartbreaking night. Japan have closed the gap on the giants of this sport to almost nothing. They led Brazil. They controlled Brazil. They were minutes from beating Brazil. The difference between them and the very best is no longer talent, no longer organization, no longer belief. The difference now lives in these tiny, agonizing moments, in the choice to push or to protect. In whether you trust your tired legs to keep swinging or you pull them off and pray your defense holds. Best in the world. They have just learned, in the cruelest way imaginable, how unforgiving those choices can be. There is a version of this match, only slightly different, where every single decision Moriyasu made is celebrated as genius. A version where Zion Suzuki holds firm for 15 more minutes, where the tie crawls into extra time, where Japan ride their luck and win a shootout and march on as the story of the tournament. In that version, the headlines praise a coach who read the danger, freshened his legs, and showed the nerve to defend a result against the odds. The decisions would have been identical. Only the ending would have changed. That is how fine the line is between a masterstroke and a mistake at this level, and Japan landed on the wrong side of it by a matter of seconds. Ritsu Doan, Keito Nakamura, and Junya Ito did not fail that night in Houston. They ran until they had nothing left, in a system that asks more of a player than almost any other in the game. They were taken off because their manager made a decision, a defensible, understandable, deeply human decision to try to hold on to something precious. It just slipped away in the final seconds anyway. That is why Japan replaced Doan, Nakamura, and Ito. Not because of one reason, but because of all of them at once. And whether you think it was brave or whether you think it was a mistake, probably says more about how you see football than about anything Moriyasu actually did. There is no clean answer here. There is only 1-1 becoming 2-1 in the 95th minute, in front of a nation that will be asking what if for a very long time to come. Let us know in the comments whether you would have made those changes or kept your attackers on. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into the tactics, the decisions, and the moments that decide the biggest matches in football. and we will see you in the next one.